Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm here with some more stories from the depths of Reddit to help you drift off tonight. Whether you're dealing with insomnia, need some background noise, or just enjoy getting lost in other people's bizarre experiences before bed, you're in the right place. I've got a collection of stories to read off tonight. Our first story comes from someone who thought they were just dealing with a nosy neighbour. My neighbour has been watching me sleep for months, and I just found out how. I moved into my current apartment about 8 months ago. It's a decent place, second floor of an older building in Portland. The rent was reasonable and the landlord seemed normal during the walkthrough. What I didn't expect was my downstairs neighbour, Margaret. Margaret is probably in her 70s, lives alone, and from day one she's known way too much about my schedule. At first I thought it was just coincidence. She'd be checking her mail right when I got home from work. She'd be watering her plants on the front steps exactly when I left for my morning jog. She'd knock on my door to borrow sugar right after I'd gotten out of the shower. But then the comments started. "You were up late last night. I could hear you moving around at 2 in the morning. Or you must have had trouble sleeping. You were tossing and turning quite a bit around midnight. I figured the walls were thin and she was just a light sleeper." The thing that really bothered me was how she always seemed to know when I was home alone versus when I had company. She'd only approach me with her random requests when I was by myself. If my girlfriend stayed over, Margaret would be nowhere to be found the next day. Last month I started having really vivid nightmares, not every night, but maybe 3 or 4 times a week. Always the same theme. Someone was in my room watching me while I slept. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, absolutely convinced someone had been standing at the foot of my bed. But when I'd turn on the lights, nothing, just my normal bedroom. The dreams were so realistic that I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked. I even moved a chair in front of it some nights. Still, the nightmares continued. I mentioned it to my girlfriend, and she suggested maybe I was just stressed about work. I figured she was probably right. 2 weeks ago, I was having one of those restless nights, where you're not quite asleep but not fully awake either. Around 3 in the morning, I heard this soft scraping sound coming from somewhere in my room. It was rhythmic, like someone gently dragging something across wood. I laid there frozen, listening. The sound would stop for maybe 30 seconds, then start again. Scrape, 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 pause. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning every corner of the room. Nothing. But then I noticed something weird. There was a small gap between my floorboards near the window that I'd never seen before. It was maybe 1 inch wide and about 6 inches long. I got up to examine it closer and realised it wasn't a natural gap in the wood. Someone had cut it. I pressed my ear to the floor and could hear faint movement below me. Margaret's apartment. The next morning I called my landlord and told him about the gap in my floor. He seemed genuinely surprised and said he'd come take a look. When he arrived, he brought tools and started prying up the floorboard near my window. What we found underneath made my stomach drop. Someone had drilled a hole straight through the floor into Margaret's ceiling. The hole was maybe 2 inches in diameter and had been carefully concealed with a piece of wood that could slide back and forth. When we moved the wood aside, we could see directly into Margaret's living room. But that wasn't the worst part. My landlord shined a flashlight down through the hole, and we could see a stepladder positioned directly underneath. On top of the ladder was a small camping chair, the kind that folds up. Next to the chair was a notebook, a pair of binoculars, and what looked like a camera with a long lens. Margaret had been climbing up on that ladder every night and watching me sleep through the hole in my floor. We called the police immediately. When they searched Margaret's apartment, they found hundreds of photos of me sleeping, detailed notes about my daily routine, and even recordings of me talking on the phone. She'd been documenting my life, like some kind of research project. The police said she'd probably been doing this since the day I moved in. The hole had been drilled precisely, and the concealment work was meticulous. She'd been planning this for months. Margaret was arrested and charged with stalking and invasion of privacy. During questioning, She told police that she wasn't trying to hurt me. She was just keeping watch because she thought I seemed lonely. She said she was trying to make sure I was safe. I've since moved to a different apartment across town. I still have trouble sleeping some nights. But now I know it wasn't just nightmares. Someone really was watching me. That story is over. Jesus, that's absolutely terrifying. The amount of planning and effort that went into stalking someone like that is just disturbing. I can't imagine how violated that person must have felt discovering all those photos and notes. Moving on to our next tale, this one comes from someone who thought they were just dealing with a glitchy phone. My phone keeps getting texts from my own number, and I'm starting to freak out. This started about 3 weeks ago. I was at work when my phone buzzed with a text message. When I looked at it, the message was from my own phone number. The text just said, "Check your back seat." I figured it was some kind of spam or glitch. I get weird messages sometimes, usually trying to sell me something or get me to click on suspicious links. But this was different because it was coming from my actual number, not some random digits. I ignored it and went back to work. But about an hour later, I got another one. Same number, my number, but this time it said, "You forgot to lock your front door this morning." That one made me pause. I tried to remember if I'd locked my door when I left for work. I'm usually pretty good about it, but I'd been running late that morning. I couldn't be sure. When I got home that evening, I checked my front door. It was unlocked. The next day, I got another text from my own number. "Your neighbour saw you come home at 6:47. I checked the timestamp on the message. It had been sent at 6:48 p.m, which was exactly 1 minute after I'd walked through my front door. I started paying closer attention to these messages. They were always about things that had just happened or things I'd just done. You left your coffee mug on your car roof. You dropped your keys in the parking lot. Someone's following you. That last one came through while I was walking home from the grocery store. I immediately turned around to look behind me, but the sidewalk was empty. Still, I took a different route home and kept checking over my shoulder. The messages were becoming more frequent. Sometimes I'd get 3 or 4 in a single day. They were always accurate, always about something current, and always sent from my own number. I tried calling my phone company to report the issue. The customer service rep was confused when I explained that I was receiving texts from myself. She put me on hold for almost 20 minutes, then came back and said their system showed no record of any text messages being sent from my number. According to their logs, my phone hadn't sent any outgoing texts in over a week. I started screenshotting every message I received. I wanted proof that this was actually happening. But when I'd go back to look at the screenshots later, they were just images of blank text conversations. The messages I'd captured were gone from the images, even though I could still see them in my actual text app. Last week, the messages started getting more specific. "You're wearing your blue shirt today. You had eggs for breakfast. You called your mum at 2:15. But then they started including things I hadn't done yet. "You're going to stop at the gas station on 5th Street. I hadn't planned on getting gas, but when I checked my fuel gauge an hour later, I was nearly empty. The closest station was on 5th Street. "You're going to order pizza tonight." I'd been planning to cook dinner, but when I got home, I realised I'd forgotten to buy groceries. I ended up ordering pizza. "You're going to have trouble sleeping tonight." That message came through at 3:30 p.m. I felt fine all day, but when bedtime came, I was wide awake. I didn't fall asleep until almost 4 a.m. Yesterday, I got a message that made me genuinely panic. "You're going to find something in your closet tonight." I've been avoiding my bedroom all day. I'm currently sitting in my living room writing this, and I can't bring myself to go check my closet. Part of me thinks this is all just some elaborate prank or coincidence, but the other part of me, the part that's been right about everything else, is telling me that I need to look. I just got another text from my own number. It says, "You're reading this message at 11:43 p.m. The timestamp shows 11:42. It's currently 11:43. I think I need to check that closet. That story ends there. Well, that's genuinely unsettling. Whether it's some kind of supernatural occurrence or just an incredibly sophisticated form of harassment. Getting predictive messages from your own phone number would mess with anyone's head. The fact that they were accurate about future events makes it even more disturbing. Our third story tonight comes from someone who discovered their roommate had some very strange habits. I found out my roommate has been collecting my hair for 6 months. I've been living with my roommate Jake for about a year now. We found each other through a roommate matching app, and things have been pretty normal. He's quiet, keeps common areas clean, pays his rent on time. We're not friends exactly, but we coexist peacefully. Jake works nights at a warehouse, so our schedules don't overlap much. I usually see him for maybe 5 or 10 minutes in the evening when he's getting ready for work, and I'm winding down for the night. Weekends, he mostly stays in his room playing video games or sleeping. About 2 months ago, I started noticing that my hairbrush was always perfectly clean. I have pretty thick hair, and usually my brush accumulates a decent amount of hair between cleanings. But suddenly, every morning, it was spotless. Not just clean, but like meticulously cleaned. At first I thought maybe Jake was being helpful and cleaning it when he cleaned the bathroom. It seemed a little weird, but not worth bringing up. I actually appreciated not having to deal with it myself. Then I noticed the same thing with my shower drain. I have long hair, and it tends to clog drains pretty quickly. I'm usually fishing hair out of the drain every few days, but the drain stayed completely clear for weeks. I mentioned it to my girlfriend when she stayed over one weekend. She thought it was sweet that my roommate was being so considerate. Maybe he's just really neat, she said. I agreed, but something about it still felt off. A few weeks later, I was doing laundry and grabbed a load of towels from the bathroom. When I pulled them out of the hamper, I noticed they were completely free of hair. Usually when I wash towels, I have to clean lint and hair out of the lint trap afterward. This time, nothing. That's when I started paying closer attention. I began checking my hairbrush before bed, and again in the morning. Sure enough, any hair that accumulated during the day would be gone. By morning, same with the shower drain, same with my pillowcase. Someone was systematically removing every trace of my hair from the apartment. Last weekend, Jake left for work but came back about an hour later, saying he'd forgotten something. I was in my room and heard him go into the bathroom, then leave again. After his footsteps faded down the hallway, I went to check the bathroom. My hairbrush, which had been full of hair when I'd used it an hour earlier, was completely clean. I decided I needed to figure out what was going on. Yesterday, I set up a small camera in the bathroom, hidden behind some toiletries on the counter. I made sure to leave plenty of hair in my brush before I went to bed. When I checked the footage this morning, I saw Jake enter the bathroom around 3 a.m. with a small plastic bag and what looked like tweezers. He spent almost 15 minutes carefully removing every single hair from my brush, placing each one individually into the bag. Then he moved to the shower and used the tweezers to extract hair from the drain. But that wasn't all. The camera caught him going through the bathroom trash, pulling out tissues I'd thrown away and examining them closely. If he found any hair, it went into the bag. I was disturbed but curious. Where was he putting all this hair? I waited until he left for work that evening, then searched his room. I found the hair in his closet. All of it, organised in labelled plastic bags by date, going back 6 months. There were dozens of bags, each one containing what looked like every strand of hair I'd lost since we'd been living together. But it gets weirder. Next to the bags was a notebook filled with detailed observations about my hair, colour variations, thickness, length measurements. He'd been documenting everything like some kind of scientific study. On the last page of the notebook, he'd written, "Collection complete soon. Ready for next phase." I have no idea what the next phase is supposed to be, and I don't want to find out. I'm moving out this weekend and I haven't told Jake. I'm just going to pack my stuff while he's at work and leave. The whole thing has me completely creeped out. I keep thinking about him sneaking around the apartment at night, collecting pieces of me while I slept. I don't know if this is some kind of weird fetish or something more sinister, but I'm not sticking around to find out. I did take photos of everything I found in his room as evidence, just in case I need to involve police later. But for now, I just want to get as far away from this situation as possible. And that story comes to an end. That is absolutely skin-crawling behaviour. The methodical collection and documentation makes it feel like the setup for something much worse. Smart move getting out of there immediately, rather than confronting someone who's clearly been obsessing over you for months. Let's move into our next story, which comes from someone who started noticing some very odd patterns in their daily routine. Everyone in my neighbourhood has the exact same daily routine, and I think I know why. I moved to Millbrook Heights about 4 months ago. It's one of those newer suburban developments where all the houses look basically identical, but the rent was cheap, and it seemed like a quiet place to start over after my divorce. The first thing I noticed was how punctual everyone was. Every morning at exactly 7:15, I'd see my neighbour across the street, Mr. Chen, leave his house in his blue Honda Civic. At 7:17, the woman 2 doors down would come out to get her newspaper. At 7:20, the guy next to her would start his motorcycle and leave for work. I thought it was just coincidence at first. Maybe everyone in the neighbourhood worked similar jobs with similar schedules. But as the weeks went by, I realised it wasn't just similar, it was identical, down to the minute. Every single day, Mr. Chen left at 7:15. Every single day, newspaper lady came out at 7:17, motorcycle guy at 7:20. The pattern never varied, not even on weekends. I started paying closer attention to other neighbours. The family with kids always left their house at 7:45, kids dressed in identical outfits, walking in a perfect line behind their parents. The elderly couple at the end of the street would emerge at 8:30 to walk their small white dog, always turning left at the corner, always returning at exactly 8:55. At first I found it amusing, like living in some kind of suburban clockwork, but then I realised I was falling into the same pattern. Without meaning to, I started leaving for work at 7:30 every morning. Not 7:28 or 7:32, 7:30 exactly. I'd find myself standing by my front door, checking my phone, waiting for the clock to hit 7:30 before I'd walk outside. When I tried to leave earlier or later, I'd feel this strange anxiety, like I was breaking some unspoken rule. One morning I forced myself to leave at 7:25, but I ended up sitting in my car until 7:30, feeling uncomfortable and wrong until the proper time arrived. The weekend routines were just as rigid. Saturday mornings at 9, everyone would come out to work on their lawns. Not some people, everyone. The entire street would be filled with the sound of lawn mowers starting up simultaneously. At exactly 10:30, the mowers would stop, and everyone would go back inside. Sunday afternoons at 2, people would emerge to wash their cars. Same routine, same timing, every single week. I tried breaking the pattern by staying inside during lawn mowing time. I watched from my window as every single house on the street had someone outside cutting grass except mine. The uniformity was eerie. About halfway through the hour, I started feeling anxious. By 10:15, I couldn't stand it anymore. I went outside and started mowing my lawn. The relief I felt when I joined the routine was immediate and intense, like I'd been holding my breath and could finally exhale. Last month, I decided to test something. I knocked on Mr. Chen's door on a Saturday morning and asked if he wanted to grab coffee. He seemed confused by the request, checking his watch repeatedly. He said he couldn't because it was lawn time, but maybe we could talk at 5:30. I asked why 5:30 specifically. He couldn't give me an answer. He just said that's when people talk to neighbours. So at 5:30, I went back to his house. He was standing on his front porch looking at his watch. The moment it hit 5:30, he smiled and waved me over. We talked for exactly 15 minutes. Pleasant conversation about the weather, how nice the neighbourhood was, general small talk. But at 5:45, he suddenly looked at his watch again and said he needed to go inside. It was time for dinner preparation. I asked him who decided these schedules. He looked at me blankly and said, "No one decided anything." This was just how things worked in Millbrook Heights. That night I couldn't sleep, so I looked out my bedroom window. At around midnight, every single house on the street was dark except for one room in each house. The same room, positioned in the same location, relative to the street. A soft blue glow came from each window, like everyone was watching television. The next morning, I asked my neighbour about what everyone watches late at night. She seemed confused and said she doesn't watch television at night. She goes to bed at 10:30 and wakes up at 6:45, same as everyone else. But I've been watching every night since then. Same blue glow, same windows, every house. It turns on at midnight and goes off at exactly 6 in the morning. I tried staying up to watch what was on my own TV at midnight, but I keep falling asleep on the couch around 10:30. I don't remember making the decision to sleep. I just find myself waking up in bed the next morning at 6:45. Yesterday, I found something that made everything click into place. I was cleaning out my garage and found a folder that must have been left by the previous tenant. Inside were dozens of documents about something called the Millbrook Community Wellness Initiative. The papers described a pilot program designed to reduce neighborhood stress and conflict through synchronized daily routines. Residents would be guided into optimal schedules that promoted community harmony and individual well-being. The program was supposed to be voluntary, but the documents mentioned something about environmental factors that would encourage participation. One page had a schedule grid that matched exactly what I'd been observing. 7:15 departure time for Unit 12, which was Mr. Chen's house. 7:17 newspaper retrieval for Unit 8. Everything was planned out to the minute. The last document in the folder was a resident evaluation form. It had my name on it, even though I'd only lived here for 4 months. Under integration status, someone had written, progressing normally. Subject shows expected resistance, but compliance increasing. Recommend continuation of current protocol. I don't know what the current protocol is, but I think I'm starting to understand why everyone's routine is so precise, and why I feel wrong when I try to break it. The scary part is that I'm not sure I want to break it anymore. The routine is comforting. It makes life simple. I know exactly what I'm supposed to be doing, and when I'm supposed to be doing it. I just wish I knew what happens during those 6 hours every night when the blue light is on and I can't remember anything until morning. That story ends there. That's genuinely chilling. The idea of an entire neighbourhood being subtly controlled without their conscious awareness is terrifying, especially the part about losing 6 hours every night. The slow realisation that the protagonist is becoming compliant despite knowing something is wrong makes it even more disturbing. Our next story comes from someone who thought they were dealing with a simple case of mistaken identity. I keep getting phone calls meant for someone who died in my apartment. I moved into my current place about 5 months ago. It's a studio apartment in an older building downtown. Nothing fancy, but the price was right. The previous tenant had apparently moved out in a hurry, leaving behind some furniture and a bunch of mail that kept showing up for weeks after I'd moved in. The name on most of the mail was David Kowalski. I dutifully wrote, "Return to sender," on everything and dropped it back in the mailbox. Eventually, the mail stopped coming, and I figured that was the end of it. But then the phone calls started. The first one came about 3 weeks after I'd moved in. My landline rang around 8 in the evening. I picked up and heard an elderly woman's voice asking for David. "I'm sorry, there's no David here," I told her. "I think you have the wrong number." She sounded confused. "This is David's number. I'm his mother. Is he there?" I explained that I'd just moved into the apartment and the previous tenant had moved out. She seemed flustered and hung up. The calls kept coming. Different people, but always asking for David Kowalski. His mother called several more times, increasingly upset each time I told her he wasn't there. A man claiming to be his brother called looking for him. Someone from what sounded like a doctor's office called to confirm an appointment. After about a week of this, I decided to call the phone company and see about getting a new number, but when I called, they told me something strange. According to their records, the phone service for my apartment had been disconnected 6 months ago due to non-payment. There was no active service at my address. That didn't make sense because I was clearly receiving and making phone calls. I was talking to them on that very phone line. The customer service representative put me on hold for a long time, then came back and said there must be some kind of system error. She took down my information and said someone would look into it. The calls continued. David's mother called almost daily, sometimes crying, asking where her son was and why he wasn't returning her calls. I started feeling terrible for her, but I didn't know what to tell her beyond the truth. One evening she called and was particularly distressed. She said David had missed his father's funeral and no one had heard from him in months. She begged me to help her find him. I felt awful for this woman. I decided to do some digging online to see if I could find any information about David Kowalski, who used to live at my address. What I found made my stomach drop. David Kowalski had died in my apartment 7 months ago. The obituary was brief but clear. David Michael Kowalski, age 34, found deceased in his residence. Cause of death was listed as natural causes, but the timing was what got me. He died 2 months before his family started calling looking for him. I found more details in a local news article. David had been found by his landlord after neighbours complained about a smell. He'd apparently been dead for over a week before anyone found him. The article mentioned that he'd been struggling with depression and had become increasingly isolated from family and friends. So his family had been calling a dead man for months, and somehow those calls were reaching me in his old apartment. I thought about calling his mother back and telling her what I'd discovered, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. How do you tell someone their son is dead when they've been talking to his phone number for months? The calls started changing after I learned the truth. Instead of just asking for David, people began having actual conversations as if he was there. His mother would call and talk for 20 or 30 minutes about her day, about family news, about how much she missed him. She'd pause occasionally, as if listening to responses I couldn't hear, then continue the conversation. His brother called and had what sounded like an argument with someone who wasn't there. He was angry about money David supposedly owed him, getting increasingly heated as he spoke to silence. The strangest call came from a woman who said she was David's ex-girlfriend. She called late at night, crying, apologising for how things had ended between them. She said she knew he couldn't forgive her, but she needed him to know she was sorry. During that call, I heard something that made my blood run cold. While she was talking, I could swear I heard a man's voice in the background, very faint, as if someone was whispering responses to her apologies. I started recording the calls, thinking maybe I was imagining things. When I played them back, most were just one-sided conversations, but on a few recordings, there were sounds I couldn't explain. Breathing that wasn't mine, faint whispers, what sounded like someone moving around the apartment while I was sitting perfectly still. Last week, David's mother called and had the most normal conversation yet. She talked about her garden, about a book she was reading, about plans for Christmas, but at the end of the call, she said something that made me hang up immediately. She said, "I know you can't talk back, David, but I can feel you listening. I'm glad you found a way to stay connected to your phone. I love you, sweetheart." After she hung up, I sat in my apartment in complete silence. That's when I heard it clearly for the first time. Footsteps moving across the floor above me, even though I live on the top floor of the building. I called my landlord the next morning and asked about the previous tenants. He confirmed that David Kowalski had died in the apartment, but he seemed surprised that I knew about it. "I thought the new tenant should know," he said, "but you never asked, so I figured it didn't matter to you." I asked him about the phone service. He said the phone company had never disconnected David's line after he died because no one had requested it. According to him, I'd been using a dead man's active phone service for 5 months, but that contradicted what the phone company had told me about there being no active service. I don't know what to believe anymore. The calls keep coming, and they're getting more frequent. Sometimes, I hear David's mother calling his name through the phone, even when I haven't answered it. Last night, I woke up to the sound of the phone ringing. When I answered, there was no one there, just empty silence. But after I hung up, I could swear I heard someone breathing in the room with me. I'm starting to think David never really left this apartment, and somehow his family's grief is keeping him connected to that phone line, whether he wants to be or not. That story ends there. The concept of grief literally keeping a dead person tethered to their old phone line is both heartbreaking and terrifying. The mother unknowingly having conversations with her deceased son, while the new tenant witnesses, it all creates such an unsettling dynamic between the living and the dead. Moving on to our final story tonight. This one comes from someone who discovered their new job had some very unusual requirements. I got hired as a night security guard, and my boss gave me a list of rules that don't make any sense. I was desperate for work when I found the posting on Craigslist. Night security guard for an office building downtown. Decent pay, minimal requirements. The ad was pretty bare bones, just said they needed someone reliable who could follow instructions and wasn't afraid of working alone. The interview was weird from the start. It was held at 10 p.m. in the lobby of the building I'd be guarding. The hiring manager, a thin guy in his 50s named Mr. Hendricks, met me at the front entrance and walked me through the building. It was a standard office complex, maybe 12 floors, mostly accounting firms and insurance companies, nothing that seemed like it would need heavy security. But Mr. Hendricks explained that they'd had issues with break-ins and vandalism, so they wanted someone on site overnight. The job seemed straightforward enough. Walk the building every 2 hours, check that all doors were locked, monitor the security cameras, write up a basic report each night. Standard security work. But then he handed me a laminated sheet of paper with a list of rules. He said these were non-negotiable policies that every night guard had to follow exactly. Rule 1. Never enter the 3rd floor between midnight and 4 a.m. Rule 2. If you hear music coming from the elevators, do not investigate. Stay at your desk until it stops. Rule 3. If someone knocks on the front door after 11 p.m, do not answer, regardless of what they say. Rule 4. The vending machine on the 7th floor sometimes dispenses items you didn't select. If this happens, take the item, but do not eat or drink it. Rule 5. If you see lights on in offices during your rounds, make a note, but do not turn them off. Rule 6. If the phone at the security desk rings more than 3 times in 1 hour, unplug it for the remainder of your shift. Rule 7. Never use the bathroom on the 9th floor. Rule 8. If you encounter anyone in the building who claims to work there, ask for their employee ID. If they cannot produce one, return to the security desk immediately and call the number written at the bottom of this page. I stared at the list, waiting for him to explain or laugh and tell me it was some kind of joke, but he just looked at me seriously and asked if I had any questions. I asked what would happen if I broke one of the rules. He said I'd be fired immediately, no exceptions. I asked why some of these rules existed. He said the previous guards had learned through experience that following them was important for everyone's safety. The pay was good enough that I decided not to ask too many more questions. I needed the job. My first week was completely normal. I walked my rounds, checked doors, watched the security monitors. Nothing unusual happened. I started thinking the rules were just some weird corporate paranoia or maybe left over from a previous security company. But on my 8th night, I learned why rule number 2 existed. I was sitting at the security desk around 1 a.m. when I heard music coming from the elevator bank. It was faint at first, some kind of classical music, maybe a waltz. I figured someone had left their phone in one of the elevators. I got up to check it out, but then I remembered the rule. No investigating elevator music. I sat back down and tried to ignore it. The music got louder. It was definitely coming from the elevators, and it sounded like a full orchestra now. I could hear violins and cellos and what might have been a piano. It was beautiful, but completely out of place. I watched the security monitor that showed the elevator bank. All 4 elevators were moving up and down constantly, stopping at different floors, but the doors never opened. The music continued for almost an hour before it finally stopped, and the elevators returned to the ground floor. The next morning, I asked Mr. Hendricks about it. He just nodded and said that's why we have rule number 2. A few nights later, I encountered rule number 4. I was doing my 2 a.m. rounds and stopped by the vending machine on the 7th floor to grab a soda. I put in my money and selected a Coke, but what came out was a bottle of water with a label I'd never seen before. The brand name was printed in a language I didn't recognize. Following the rule, I took the bottle but didn't drink it. When I got back to the security desk, I put it in the lost and found box that Mr. Hendricks had told me to use for anything unusual. The strangest incident happened during my 3rd week. I was doing a midnight round when I saw lights on in several offices on the 5th floor. Following rule number 5, I made a note but didn't turn them off. But as I was walking past one of the lit offices, I heard voices inside. Multiple people having what sounded like a normal business meeting. I could hear papers shuffling, chairs moving, someone giving a presentation. I checked my watch. It was 12:30 a.m. on a Saturday night. I remembered rule number 8 and decided to investigate. I knocked on the office door and announced myself as security. The voices stopped immediately. A woman opened the door. She was dressed in business attire and looked completely normal, except for the fact that she was there in the middle of the night. Behind her, I could see about 6 other people sitting around a conference table with papers and laptops spread out. I asked for her employee ID. She smiled and said she'd left it in her other bag. Could she just tell me her name instead? Following the rule, I immediately returned to the security desk and called the number at the bottom of the rule sheet. Mr. Hendricks answered on the first ring, even though it was past midnight. I told him what had happened. He said he'd handle it and that I should stay at my desk for the rest of the night. About 20 minutes later, I saw him enter the building through the front door. He went straight to the elevators and up to the 5th floor. I watched the security monitors, but the cameras on that floor went fuzzy whenever I tried to focus on the area where the meeting had been happening. Mr. Hendricks came back down about an hour later. He stopped by the security desk and told me I'd done the right thing by following the rules. He said the people I'd encountered weren't employees and that this kind of thing happened sometimes. I asked him who they were and what they wanted. He said some buildings attract unusual activity, and that's why we had the security protocols. He didn't elaborate beyond that. I've been working here for 2 months now, and I've encountered almost every rule on the list. The 3rd floor thing happened last week. I accidentally got off the elevator on the 3rd floor around 2 a.m. and immediately felt like something was very wrong. The temperature was at least 20 degrees colder than the rest of the building, and I could hear what sounded like typing coming from every office, even though they were all dark. I got back on the elevator immediately and didn't include the incident in my report. Some things are better left undocumented. The job pays well, and the work isn't difficult as long as you follow the rules exactly. I've stopped questioning why these policies exist. I've learned that some buildings have their own ecosystem of weirdness, and it's better to work around it than try to understand it. My only concern is that Mr. Hendricks mentioned they've had trouble keeping night guards long term. When I asked why, he said most people either quit after a few weeks or stop following the rules. I asked what happens to guards who stop following the rules. He said they usually just stop showing up to work one day. I've been very careful to follow every rule exactly as written. That story is over. Working a job where breaking the rules could literally make you disappear is nightmare fuel. The fact that the boss was so matter-of-fact about previous guards just vanishing makes it even more terrifying. Sometimes ignorance really is bliss when it comes to workplace policies. Our next story comes from someone who thought they'd found the perfect apartment deal. I found an apartment that was way too cheap, and now I know why. I was apartment hunting in Seattle last spring when I found a listing that seemed too good to be true. A 1-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill for $800 a month. Everything else in that neighborhood was going for at least $1,500, so I figured there had to be a catch. I called the number in the listing and spoke to a woman named Mrs. Chen, who said she was the property manager. She had a slight accent and sounded elderly. She explained that the apartment had been vacant for a while, and the owner was motivated to rent it quickly. When I asked why it was so cheap, she said the previous tenants had left suddenly, and they just wanted someone reliable who would take good care of the place. She offered to show it to me that afternoon. The building was older, but well maintained, and the apartment itself was actually really nice. Hardwood floors, updated kitchen, good natural light. The only weird thing was that it came fully furnished. Mrs. Chen explained that the previous tenant had left everything behind, and the owner didn't want to deal with moving it all out. The furniture was decent quality, but had an odd feel to it. Everything was slightly too formal for the space, like it belonged in a much fancier apartment. The bed was perfectly made with hospital corners. The books on the shelves were organised by height rather than subject. Even the clothes in the closet were arranged by colour and season. Mrs. Chen said I could keep anything I wanted and donate the rest. She seemed eager to get the place rented and offered to waive the security deposit if I could move in within a week. I should have been more suspicious, but I needed a place, and the price was impossible to pass up. I signed the lease that day. The first month was completely normal. I gradually replaced the previous tenant's belongings with my own stuff, though I kept some of the nicer pieces. The apartment was quiet, the neighbours were friendly, and I felt like I'd gotten incredibly lucky. But then I started noticing small things that seemed off. Sometimes I'd come home and find items had been moved slightly. A book I'd left on the coffee table would be back on the shelf. A coffee mug I'd left in the sink would be clean and back in the cabinet. At first, I thought I was just forgetting where I'd put things. Then I realised that someone was cleaning my apartment while I was at work. Not just tidying up, but deep cleaning. The floors would be mopped, the bathroom would be spotless, even my laundry would be folded and put away. It was like having an invisible maid service. I called Mrs. Chen to ask if building maintenance had access to my apartment. She seemed confused and said no one should be entering without my permission. She promised to look into it, but the cleaning continued. Every day I'd come home to find my apartment in perfect condition. It was actually kind of nice at first, until I realised someone was also going through my personal belongings. My mail would be sorted and organised on the kitchen counter. My computer files had been reorganised into new folders. Even my phone contacts had been alphabetised and cleaned up, with duplicate entries removed. Someone was living in my apartment during the day while I was at work, and they were methodically organising my entire life. I decided to test this theory by leaving small markers around the apartment before I left for work. A pen placed at a specific angle on my desk, a book open to a particular page, a coffee cup positioned just so on the counter. When I came home, everything had been moved, but more than that, everything had been improved. The pen was now in a proper pen holder, the book was closed and shelved appropriately, the coffee cup was clean and stored away. I set up a hidden camera in my living room to see who was doing this. What I captured on video was not what I expected. It was me, not someone who looks like me, but actually me. Same clothes I'd worn to work that day, same hairstyle, same everything. But this version of me moved differently, more precisely. Every action was deliberate and efficient. I watched myself vacuum the apartment with military precision, organise my bookshelf according to some system I didn't understand, and clean my kitchen until it sparkled. This other me worked for about 6 hours, then sat down on my couch and just stared at the wall until it was time for the real me to come home. Right before I could be heard coming up the stairs, the other me would simply vanish. Not walk out of frame, not hide somewhere, just disappear. I confronted Mrs. Chen with the video. She watched it calmly, then asked if I was happy with the apartment maintenance. I told her this was completely insane and demanded an explanation. She explained that the previous tenant had been very particular about cleanliness and organisation. When he left, some of his habits had remained in the space. She called it residual behaviour and said it was fairly common in older buildings. I asked if she meant the apartment was haunted. She said not exactly haunted, but that some places hold onto the patterns of previous occupants. The cleaning and organising would continue whether I liked it or not. She offered to let me out of the lease with no penalty if I was uncomfortable with the situation. But she also mentioned that most tenants learn to appreciate the arrangement after a while. I decided to stay. The rent was still incredibly cheap, and having a perfectly clean apartment wasn't exactly a hardship. I just had to get used to sharing the space with some kind of echo of the previous tenant. It's been 6 months now, and I've settled into a routine. I leave small messes for my other self to clean up. Sometimes I deliberately disorganize things just to see how they'll be fixed. It's become almost like a game. The only rule I've established is that my other self isn't allowed to touch my bedroom. I put a sign on the door that says "Private, do not enter," and so far it's been respected. I still don't understand exactly what's happening, but I've learned to coexist with whatever force is maintaining my apartment. The rent is still $800, and I have the cleanest place in the city. Sometimes I wonder what happened to the previous tenant and why his habits are still so strong in this space. But Mrs. Chen says some questions are better left unasked, and I'm inclined to agree with her. That story is over. Having a supernatural cleaning service sounds like a dream until you realise there's another version of you methodically going through all your personal belongings. The fact that the previous tenant's obsessive habits literally imprinted on the apartment is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. All right, everyone. We've reached the end of tonight's collection of strange tales from the internet. Whether these stories helped you drift off or kept you wide awake, I hope you found them as intriguing as I did. If you're still listening at this point and enjoyed this journey into the weird corners of human experience, consider subscribing for more content like this. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next one.